You have a romantic relationship with every leading man you've ever starred with.
I make jokes about it, but I call it the cinema gods, and they mess with us. And the first thing that happens, usually, is the love scene.
Before you get to know each other?
For decades, one question has followed Diane Lane everywhere she has gone, whispered in entertainment columns and repeated in online threads and passed between people who were convinced they had the whole story figured out. And the most surprising thing about that question, how much of the scandal was actually true, is not the answer itself but how completely the answer has been hiding in plain sight the entire time, obscured not by secrecy but by the gap between what people assumed and what Diane Lane actually said and did and chose across 60 years of a life that was always more complicated and more quietly extraordinary than the version the tabloid ecosystem constructed around it. She was born on January 22, 1965, in New York City, and the detail that immediately reframes everything that follows is that her parents separated 13 days after her birth, not years later when memories had formed and attachments had solidified, but before life had settled into any recognizable shape at all, which meant that the first thing Diane Lane ever learned about belonging was that it could disappear before you even knew you had it. Custody went to her mother, Colleen Farrington, a nightclub singer and former Playboy centerfold whose public glamour and private unpredictability created an early environment defined more by inconsistency than by anything resembling stable ground, and childhood unfolded in a world without steady routine, shaped by movement and emotional uncertainty and the particular anxiety of never quite knowing what came next. Her maternal grandmother, a Pentecostal preacher within the apostolic denomination, offered a contrasting presence, and in the rhythm and theatrical intensity of those sermons Diane received, without anyone intending it, an early education in performance, emotional crescendos, storytelling structure, the mechanics of commanding a room, long before she ever set foot in a formal rehearsal space. At around age 6, custody transitioned to her father, Burton Lane, a drama coach with connections to the world surrounding John Cassavetes, who also drove a cab and later taught humanities at City College, a man whose household blended genuine artistic investment with its own version of instability. He enrolled her at the La Mama Experimental Theater Club, one of New York's most respected experimental performance spaces, and by around age 12 she was appearing in a Joseph Papp production of The Cherry Orchard alongside Meryl Streep, which tells you something about how early and how seriously her talent had been recognized by the people positioned to recognize it. What it does not tell you is that the domestic stability she was building her craft inside remained fragile throughout, with her mother reappearing intermittently, the father's household creatively nurturing but emotionally inconsistent, and childhood unfolding across overlapping worlds without a fixed center, which meant that the lesson Diane Lane absorbed most thoroughly before she ever stood in front of a camera was that belonging was not a permanent condition but something conditional and shifting and always subject to renegotiation. She was 13 when director George Roy Hill cast her in A Little Romance, a film that also starred Laurence Olivier, which is not exactly a subtle debut, and the response when the film came out in 1979 was extraordinary in a way that would have been difficult for anyone to process, let alone a teenager whose personal life had never been straightforward. Olivier called her the new Grace Kelly. Time magazine put her on their cover. Hollywood looked at Diane Lane and saw a future that felt almost too good to be complicated. A girl with raw and unconventional beauty and an inner emotional life that translated on camera in a way that could not be manufactured or taught, and directors who worked with her in those early years described it in terms that bordered on mystical. Francis Ford Coppola cast her in The Outsiders in 1983 alongside a cast that reads like a roll call of the decade: Matt Dillon, Tom Cruise, Patrick Swayze, Rob Lowe, Emilio Estevez, and then cast her again the same year in Rumble Fish, and the momentum should have been unstoppable. Instead it stalled, not because the talent had gone anywhere but because the transition from child sensation to adult star is one of the most treacherous passages in Hollywood, and the industry at that particular moment did not quite know what to do with her. The Cotton Club in 1984 was expensive and messy and flopped despite its cast. Streets of Fire underperformed. The film world that had been so loudly in love with this teenage prodigy started to cool, and Diane spent years in what she later acknowledged was a professional wilderness. Films that did not work, roles that were not right, and an industry that had moved on without formally saying so. The comeback did not arrive through a massive blockbuster or a headline-grabbing reinvention but through television, specifically the 1989 miniseries Lonesome Dove, which earned her an Emmy nomination and reminded audiences of something that should never have required reminding. She rebuilt the career steadily through the 1990s, Chaplin in 1992, A Walk on the Moon in 1999, which remains one of the most genuinely underrated performances of an already remarkable body of work. And the pattern visible across those roles is not coincidental. Again and again, she was drawn to women who wanted more than circumstances seemed willing to provide, women searching for freedom or fulfillment or a different version of the life they had been handed. And again she found something truthful within those characters that went beyond the requirements of the script. The relationship timeline that ran alongside all of this professional rebuilding is the part of the story that gets told most messily and with the least useful context. In the early 1980s, while moving through young Hollywood during the Outsiders period, she was linked to Timothy Hutton, who had just won an Oscar for Ordinary People, and Christopher Atkins and Matt Dillon, and what almost never gets acknowledged in the retelling is how young all of this actually was. These were teenage years and early adulthood, a time when most people are still becoming themselves, and adding sudden fame and constant attention and being surrounded by other young actors in a fast-moving world made relationships form quickly and feel complicated in ways that had everything to do with the circumstances and very little to do with character. Around 1985 there was John Bon Jovi, just before he became a global phenomenon, a working-class musician from New Jersey and a young actress from an unconventional New York background, both stepping into enormous careers at the same time, a connection that made sense in that stage of life even if it did not last. The most significant relationship of that period began when she met Christopher Lambert in Paris in 1984 during press for the Cotton Club, a French actor with a very different background from the Hollywood world surrounding her. And after a brief early connection they went their separate ways and then found each other again approximately 2 years later while working on a film together. They married in 1988. Diane spoke openly in later interviews about this period, describing the emotional reality of the marriage with an honesty that was remarkable for its absence of bitterness. She had felt alone within it, not because Lambert was cruel, but because long stretches of separation had shaped the relationship in ways that left her reaching for closeness she could not access. She used the phrase rock bleeder to describe herself, someone who keeps trying to extract emotional sustenance from situations or people who may not be able to provide it, and that phrase is more illuminating than any rumor ever generated about her because it is her own language for her own recognized pattern, offered without self-pity and without deflection. Their daughter Eleanor. Jasmine Lambert was born in 1993. They divorced in 1994. The separation came not from a dramatic public rupture, but from the quieter understanding that the relationship was not working, and both remained respectful and connected through their daughter in the years that followed. Then came Unfaithful. Released in 2002 and directed by Diane Lane, the film did not simply revive a career that had been steadily rebuilding anyway. It redefined how the public saw Diane Lane entirely and created a layer of speculation that has followed her ever since, because her performance as a happily married woman who enters a passionate and destructive affair with a younger man was so specific and so viscerally truthful that it did not feel like acting. It felt, to audiences and critics alike, like a memory. The Academy nominated her for Best Actress. The rumor ecosystem went into a frenzy asking whether the emotional truth of the performance was autobiographical, whether Diane Lane had been unfaithful in her own marriage to Lambert, whether the character's experience was drawn from something that had actually happened. What Diane Lane has actually said about the role, and this matters, is that it was understood through craft rather than confession. She trained in experimental theater where acting is built on emotional truth drawn from within rather than surface imitation, which means the work involves accessing emotional patterns and internal contradictions and memories of feeling rather than reproducing specific autobiographical events. She described the character as a woman who still loved her husband while also being drawn into something that existed alongside that love rather than replacing it, and she identified that duality as the most honest and unsettling element of the story. At no point has she described the role as autobiographical, and at no point has the opposite been confirmed, which has not prevented the speculation from continuing because speculation does not require confirmation to sustain itself. It was during the period when Unfaithful was gaining attention that she began a new relationship with Josh Brolin, the son of James Brolin and stepson of Barbra Streisand, whom she met at a premiere party for A Beautiful Mind in 2002. They married in 2004, and within months of the wedding, on December 5th of that year, police were called to their home. Brolin was arrested on a misdemeanor charge of domestic battery after an officer confirmed that Lane had called police because Brolin had hit her. He was booked and released. Diane declined to press charges. Their representatives called it a misunderstanding. What almost never gets examined with appropriate seriousness is what happened next. She did not file for divorce until 2013, which means the marriage continued for 8.5 years after an incident serious enough to involve police and a public record. That timeline does not simplify into any clean narrative, and it should not, because domestic situations in real life are precisely as complicated as that timeline suggests. She was a woman who had never in her life had a stable model for what a healthy relationship looked like, who had spent years trying to make a marriage to Lambert work even when she described herself as essentially alone within it, who had spoken openly about wanting desperately to belong to someone and have someone belong to her. She was not naive about what was happening. She was someone whose entire history had taught her that belonging was conditional and worth fighting for even when the cost was high, and that context does not excuse anything, but it explains something true about why people stay in situations that outside observers find impossible to understand. When she did file in 2013, she cited irreconcilable differences and asked for no spousal support. In a 2018 interview, Brolin said about the 2004 incident that there was no explaining it. Not a defense, not a justification, just acknowledgement. Diane has not spoken at length about the Brolin years, and that restraint is its own kind of statement, not performing victimhood, not rewriting history, simply declining to give that chapter more oxygen than it requires. The rumors that have circulated around Diane Lane across decades, the serial cheater narrative, the idea that unfaithful mirrors her real life, the accumulated speculation built from 2 divorces and 1 extraordinarily powerful film performance, carry no supporting evidence in her own words. They exist because there is no competing flood of personal disclosure to balance them. She has never been someone who overshares, never used social media as a confessional, never shaped her public presence around emotional revelation, and in the space left by that restraint interpretation has moved in and built a version of her life that says more about public imagination than about anything she has actually confirmed. What she has confirmed is something quieter and more grounded. A life shaped by the search for connection and stability, choices made within that search that did not always lead to lasting outcomes, a continued commitment to work across 6 decades, and a refusal to be reduced to any single storyline regardless of how insistently it has been repeated. Laurence Olivier reportedly compared her to Grace Kelly not only for beauty or screen presence but for composure. A sense of self-containment that felt unusual even in 1979 and has only deepened in the decades since. She is still working, still evolving, still taking on roles that have nothing to do with nostalgia, and her daughter Eleanor is building her own creative path in writing and modeling. The rumors will probably continue because they do not require evidence to survive, and because the gap between her public visibility and her genuine privacy creates a space that speculation will always rush to fill. But the truth, which has been available all along for anyone willing to look past the noise, is not a scandal. It is a life of considerable complexity, shaped by a childhood that offered very little stability and an industry that offered enormous pressure, navigated by a woman who was always more honest about her own patterns than the people writing about her ever bothered to notice, and who chose, consistently and deliberately, to let her work speak rather than filling the silence with anything the world had no right to know.